Hi, and welcome back. Our next lecture will be on test-driven development. All right, so what is test-driven development? Well, test-driven development is quite popular amongst professional engineers as an approach to writing code. All right, so what test-driven development is that you write tests, and tests are also code, that run your code, and then compare the behavior of the code that you've written against the test that you've defined. Right? So basically, we write tests, and we write code that passes those tests, and we keep going until we build our application. So what are benefits of test-driven development? Well, one is that you clearly define the expectations of how your code should work, right? So you're saying that when I run this function with these inputs, I expect this to come out. And if you go in there without clearly thinking about what should happen or not happen, oftentimes your code can be very sloppy. Automated tests verify that your code is working as expected, right? So instead of console logging and running little pieces of code over and over again, if you run the automated test and they work, and your code works against this automated test, you know that your code is at least behaving properly under the specification of your test. And then the final thing is that well-written tests really help other people understand how they're supposed to use your code. Right? So a test might say, when you pass it these things to this function, you should get this output. So it tells them what kind of things that you're expected to pass and why it might do that thing, and then what kind of output to expect. So the drawbacks of testing is that one is that tests take time to write because it's like every piece of code you write, you have to write other code to run that code, right? So just writing more code, and that tests can be difficult to read, right? So it's a little bit of invert, right? When you're writing code, you're saying do this thing, and then when you're writing tests, you're saying do the code and then expect this thing, right? So it's a little bit of an inverted take to how you're writing code, and for beginners, oftentimes the hardest part is just learning how to read the tests that they're given. Now, test-driven development is a pretty central tool that we use at Fullstack, right? One, we think that it's a great learning tool. So oftentimes what we'll do is we'll give you an assignment and say, look, here's all the tests already written for you. Can you write code that pass all these tests? So then your job is thinking, okay, what is this test expecting to do, and how do I write code that passes it? And it's a great skill set to be able to read tests and eventually to be able to write tests. So in bootcamp prep, you won't write your own tests. I think it's a little bit hard kind of out the gate to start thinking about writing tests. We've written all the tests here in bootcamp prep. Every workshop that you do from here on will use test-driven development. You'll be given tests and expected to pass those tests. And it's really great too because you're getting a very quick feedback cycle, right? You write some code and you run all the tests against it, and you can immediately see, does your code pass all the expectations that we have for you writing that code? So as Elliot mentioned earlier, there's a few setups that you can use. One setup is you can use the CodePen links inside all the workshops. So every practice problem, the link itself goes to a CodePen. And so you click on that CodePen link, and then you'll write your code in the JS section of the CodePen under where we have a comment, your code here. And then just click the run button to run your code and run the test. Now I have to emphasize, this is a perfectly fine way to do bootcamp prep. Don't worry about what I'm going to say next. If you want to run code in CodePen this way, CodePen is great for these kind of short form exercises. It runs all the specs properly. It's not going to impede your learning. In fact, it will just speed you up going along. So feel free to use the CodePen. And it's very simple. We have them all set up. Now, if you want to be, if you want to get your tests local to be able to run locally on your computer, we've also made that as simple as possible for you to set up. First, download all the practice problems for this course. You can see there's a link here to download all the problems inside of each exercise page. Then you'll open that folder in Visual Studio Code. And then inside Visual Studio Code, you can use Testem. And Testem will do the exact same thing. It sets up a browser, it sets up the specs to run, and then it gives you, then you edit the file to write your code that the test will run against. So it's a little bit confusing because if you've never written a web server before, when you run Testem, what you're basically doing is your computer is running a program that creates a web server, and you go to that using Google Chrome. So it feels like you're on the internet because you're using Google Chrome, but you're really going to a server right on your machine. And the nice thing about this is that, let's say you want to work on this on the airplane. I don't know if you can watch our YouTube videos on the airplane, but let's say you want to work on this airplane, then you can have all the exercises right there. You don't have to go to CodePen, and you get to just practice using a visual code editor. So the way that this works in both CodePen and in Visual Studio is that all the tests are initially failing, right? So you see all this sea of red. You'll say 9 specs that we found, and that they're all failing. And then each one here is a test, and it says we've written the code in our test to kind of tell you what we expect to do, and this will say, hey, this thing that you're expecting is failing. So when you save your code file, what you'll see is that all the tests will run again. So that's what Testim does, is it says, oh, I see a file changed, a .js file change, I'm gonna run all my tests again. And hopefully, if you got the code right, you pass 1 or 2 tests, and then it'll just show you, okay, you have 9 tests, 7 are failing, 6 are failing. And when you pass all tests, you go to this page will look nice and green. So that's what we know in TDD we call getting the code to green, means getting all the tests passing. So in a professional software development environment, you might have in a piece of software hundreds, if not thousands, of tests, right? And every time you make a feature, you add some new code or modify the code anyway, you want to make sure you run all these thousands of tests before you push the code into production, right? So at least all the tests that you have that you expect to work continue to work. So here we can look at passing the first test in this favorite activity. So we will do it using CodePen. So if I go to CodePen here, so here you can see I can download all the exercises here, or I can just go click favorite activity and get to the CodePen itself, right? So here in this favorite activity, when I run it, you see that favorite activity should be coding, right? So this is what we call the spec view, right? These are the tests that are failing. So how does it, this is pretty crazy, right? Like, how does it know to say favorite activity should be coding, right? So here we look at the test itself, right? So here in JS, you write your code here, and below your code is going to be the code that tests your code, right? So this code, we can read it, describe favorite activity. And so that can be, describe just means talk about this thing, right? Favorite activity, it could be a function, it could be an object. It just says describe it. And then we say it should be coding. Then the test, the bulk of the test is right here. So what this test says is expect that favorite activity, when this test is run, to equal the string of coding, right? And then how does it know that it's not working? It says, well, hey, we're getting this error, a reference error, favorite activity is not defined, right? So when the test runner gets this line of code, says, well, I expect favorite activity to be coding, and it looks at favorite activity, it looks for that, and says, oh, this thing is not even defined. I can't even find the reference to this word. So how do we fix that? You can say, well, hey, let's just create the variable favorite activity, and then if we do that and we click run, now we get a different error, right? So favorite activity should be coding, it's still failing, but now the error is, well, I expect undefined to equal coding. This is giving us a better clue, right? I expected this value, which is what favorite activity actually is, to equal what you said it should be, the string coding, right? So, as we know, when we create variables, they start out as undefined until we assign something into them. So let's assign something here. I actually make code that assigns the string coding into favorite activity. Now if I run this, you see, I get to green, right? I have 1 spec and 0 failures. So that feels good. Getting to green feels great. All right, so when we save the code, we get that output that the favorite activity is not defined. We created that favorite activity variable, and then we set to coding, and it passed. All right, so the reason you see here 9 specs and 8 failures is because there's just it depends a little bit. If you're running on a local machine, it depends on it might find more specs than actually exists there. So I'll show you how this works on your local machine. So here, instead of doing it inside of CodePen, let's pretend that we downloaded from LearnDot. So we downloaded a folder. You'll see that inside of each So I downloaded the folder Bootcamp Prep Master. And inside that folder, I can see pre-work workshops and workshops. If I go to pre-work workshops, and then I go to the one here, expressions and variables, you can see here I can go to favorite activity. So I go to favorite activity, change CD, just change directory. And here I see the file. So if I'm going to do something here, cat just outputs the content of the file, favorite activity.js, that has just an empty file of your code below. And then if I output the spec one, it has a spec. So when I run Testim here sets up a server. I can go back to Chrome. And here I go to localhost 7357. And you see what this does is it hits that Testim running in your terminal and runs the spec in that directory. You see one spec, one failure. All right. Now if I go back here, let me create a new terminal in this directory and edit this file. Now here, I'm going to do the same thing and say, well, actually, the best way to do this is to split this into two windows. And then in one window, open your code file, and in the other window, have your spec. And then say, okay, now I can read the spec. It says favorite activity should be coding, so I'll do let favorite activity. This is partial solution. And then you'll see here, as soon as I save the file, Testim refreshed the page and ran all the tests again. So now we get that error that we saw in CodePen, expected undefined to equal coding. Right? Now if I go back here and fix this, let favorite activity equal to coding. Of course, that's going to be in a string. Now if I go back to Testim, I get one spec, 0 failures. All my tests are passing. All right, so that tells you how to run tests both on CodePen, which we think is a great solution for you to do if you're having trouble getting your local environment set up, and also how to run it on a local machine by downloading that zip file and going into each exercise and running Testim in that directory, and then going to it from your Chrome browser. So I highly recommend, if you want to play locally, you can do it that way, but if not, feel free to use CodePen. It's perfectly fine. All right, and then also just a little bit note on reading the test, right? So it's useful to read the test and be able to understand what it's asking for, right? So if you go back to CodePen, we're looking for that one line. The expect is your key on saying this is what I want to happen, right? So expect, and then this is going to be expression, right? Eventually, this inside of this expect is going to be some value, right? So favorite activity, or it could be a function call or whatever, but this is going to value to a value. And that's going to have to equal the value that you define in this test. Right? So this one is hard-coded, and this one is what happens, what running the code makes something happen. Right? And so when the value stored in favorite activity equals the value coding, this test will pass. So as you're working through this, look for lines that start with the word expect. That should be your trigger word to understand that this is what I'm expected to do to make this test pass. All right, so as a quick recap, we talked a little bit about the benefits of test-driven development, and some of the cons, right? We've got to write more code. Want to emphasize again that using CodePen is completely fine. It's a great way to get started. And then talk a little about reading tests, right? We're looking for the expect keyword, and that's how we pass the spec. All right, good luck. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to have a lot of specs ahead to pass and read and understand, and it's going to be a great way to learn, and we'll see you next lecture.